Lecture 34, Rabindranath Tagore's Stories and Poems.
This lecture deals with Rabindranath Tagore of India, who, as I mentioned last time, was the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. With Tagore, we reach the 20th century, in which, as we said way back in the first lecture in this course, literary movements will all become more international. Improved communications and economic relationships and readjustments in political alliances, and of course a host of wars have allowed influences to travel back and forth across international boundaries in the 20th century far more readily than they did in the past. Translations, too, have become more available in the 20th century than they were in the past, so that even for those of us who don't read all the languages, Sanskrit and Norwegian and Chinese and Japanese, we'll be able to get at these works in translation at any rate. And so that in all these ways, there's been a much faster travel of ideas and techniques across international borders. So that today, for example, there can be a Japanese Kurt Vonnegut. Ibsen's plays can deeply impact Chinese drama. Eastern poets like Rumi and Gibran can influence Western poets, and not to mention closer influences like the magic realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or French structuralism or deconstruction or feminism. All of these things can travel across borders much faster. We've had occasion to mention the Norton Anthology of World Masterpieces a couple of times in this course, and when they get to the 20th century, they don't divide the 20th century literature up by language or country anymore. They simply arrange all of the authors in chronological order, and they call that last unit the modern world, self and other in global context. And it's interesting to notice that in their anthology, Tagore comes right between Sigmund Freud and William Butler Yeats. So there's an Indian between an Austrian and an Irishman. So there's a way in which 20th century literature is going to be far more international than it has ever been in the past. And we will try to pay attention in the lectures that follow to some of those connections between cultures, because in a way the 20th century has come closer to creating a really, really true world literature than we've ever been in the past. With Tagore, we also reach the first of our modern short stories. So we have one new genre to introduce in this lecture. Short stories themselves are, of course, as old as literature itself. There are short stories that survive from Egypt, and Ruth and Jonah in the Old Testament, for example, can be read as short stories. And many of the collections we've talked about in this course, like the Decameron or the Heptameron, or the 1001 Nights, or the Jataka, or the Ocean of the Rivers of Story, all of these things were collections of short stories. And the 19th century itself was a great age for short story. Almost everybody who was anybody as a writer in the 19th century tried his or her hand at short stories, all the way from Edgar Allan Poe to Balzac. But the short story still gets reinvented for the 20th century by such writers as Chekhov and James Joyce and Hemingway. And I think that the most important influence on the modern short story is probably that of Anton Chekhov. Earlier short stories had been really like short novels, using the same devices and techniques that novels do. And the distinction between a novel and a short story was primarily one of length. Most short stories were like episodes from novels, and they depended more on plot and on external issues than on psychological ones. And that's partly because characterization was always one of the things that had to get sacrificed. If you have only a tiny space to work in, there were other concerns that subordinated the issue of characterization. Chekhov, in his short stories, transferred the central action from the external to the internal world, from external events to internal ones, and focused on mental processes that occur inside the character, not on the external world. We've already seen this in our last lecture on Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, where we said that what happens in that play does not have much to do with what happens in the external world. At the end of the play, we are pretty much back to where we started at the beginning. The circumstances haven't changed. What has changed in that play is the awareness of the characters, which is very different at the end of the play than it is at the beginning. Chekhov was going to apply those same kinds of regulations or rules to the short story that he did in his plays. Some of this, of course, had already been anticipated in the short story. Chekhov didn't actually totally invent this kind of story. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, spends a lot of his time in his story spending as much time on the internal life of the characters as he does what happens externally. And of course, Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich is, although it's a story about a man dying, it spends more time worrying about what goes on inside the man's head than the progress of the disease on his body. But still, having said all of that, Chekhov still made these internal events the focus of the entire story. In Chekhov's short stories, as in his plays, nothing much really seems to happen. There's a little elegant story that he wrote called Gooseberries, in which a man goes to visit his brother. His brother is a retired clerk who has saved his money very carefully, and when he retires, he buys a little tiny farm. The brother gets there to visit him about the time that the gooseberries are almost ripe. And the brother is very, very proud of these gooseberries and talks about them a lot. And the brother, who's the visiting brother, is awakened several times in the night by his brother tiptoeing down into the kitchen to eat another gooseberry, even though they aren't quite ripe yet. They're almost ripe, but not quite there. What matters in this story isn't what happens, because very little actually happens in the story. But what's really important is, first of all, the happiness of the clerk in his gooseberries, in his almost ripe gooseberries. And then the second thing, the really important thing, is the kind of troubled thoughts which are stimulated in the visiting brother by his brother's fascination with his gooseberries. Virginia Woolf, in a really important essay that she called Modern Fiction, said that Chekhov changed the entire focus of fiction by making it spiritual, was her word. She used spiritual. And I think by spiritual, she meant either internal or psychological, vis-a-vis the emphasis on the external world. Her contention was that so much of the fiction up until the beginning of the 20th century had been so focused on the external world that it misses what's really important. Chekhov, she says, found out what was really important in a story and focused on that. So I think in the 20th century, almost everyone relearned how to write a short story from Chekhov. We'll see his influence on James Joyce in a later lecture. What Joyce did is took those little internal awarenesses, those little adjustments, those minor adjustments that characters make, and called them epiphanies. And in his stories, which we'll take a look at when we look at the Dubliners, his stories really focus on those epiphanies, those little tiny adjustments that a character makes internally rather than on a well-defined plot, which older short stories tended to emphasize. And of course, Chekhov's influence is very much apparent on, say, Sherwood Anderson with that great collection of stories, Winesburg, Ohio, on those beautiful, magnificent little early short stories of Ernest Hemingway, and a little later on the stories of someone like Catherine Mansfield. The other Chekhovian technique which he emphasized and helped to bring to the modern short story was an objective point of view. We have seen, as we've been talking about realism, that the realists tried to abstract themselves out of the story the way a scientist would out of an experiment, to let the experiment or the story speak for itself. Chekhov always said that a writer shouldn't tell his readers whether he believes in God, whether he believes in marriage, whether he believes in revolution. None of that really matters, he said. The job of a writer is to report what the characters say and do as accurately as he can, and then get out of the way. We've seen variations on that rubric already in Flaubert and in Twain and in Chekhov himself in the drama. This is simply part of realism. But if we put all these things together, we get a pretty good idea of what makes the modern short story different from short stories in earlier periods of history. Rabindranath Tagore stands at kind of a crossroads for all of this. Because of the dominance of Europe in the last half of the 19th century, and after World War I, America became a dominant cultural power as well. Every other country in the West was influenced in many ways by the West, literature included. India in particular had been a British colony from about 1800 to 1947, but the influence of Britain on India goes back much earlier than that, back to about the time of the East India Company in about 1600. So after 400 years, British influence was everywhere in India. It was in the educational system, it was in the civil service system, it was present in the thousands of young Indians who had gone to Europe to study at European universities in order to prepare themselves to come back home as doctors, as lawyers, as government officials. India has over 200 regional languages and dialects, but by 1947, English had come pretty close to becoming the common language, and many Indians to this day still write in English. The very last writer we take up in this course will be Salman Rushdie, and Salman Rushdie is an Indian who writes in English. By the time England or the Britain arrived in India, Indian literature already had a 3,000-year-old tradition. But when Western influence arrived, it either marginalized Indian traditions or at least modified them. And so in this course, in this lecture, we will be looking at essentially Western-style short stories written by an Indian author who was half-educated in Europe and who admitted when he was asked what his biggest influences were on his literature, admitted that it was Chekhov, Turgenev, George Bernard Shaw, and Henrik Ibsen. So that all four of those are Western writers. What's also interesting about that list is the fact that all four are realist writers, which was, of course, the avant-garde tradition in Europe in Tagore's day. This is, of course, something that's going to happen all over the non-Western world in the 20th century, the earliest 20th century. In our next lecture, we will see the same thing happening in Japan. The earliest Western-influenced writings in these non-Western countries will share the same qualities of realism that they have in the West. They will be about middle or lower class characters. They will use relatively objective presentation with minimal authorial intrusion, and they will include a great deal of social criticism. We remember that Flaubert attacked the bourgeoisie in France. Indian realist writers will attack those who perpetuate the caste system, those who oppress women, and those who benefit from the sufferings of the poor. Now, Rabindranath Tagore was in a splendid position to absorb and domesticate all of his Western models. He was something of a universal man. He's something the equivalent of an Indian Goethe, in that he achieved so many things and did so many things so brilliantly during his lifetime. He was a poet, he was a novelist, he was a dramatist, he was an essayist, he was a teacher who founded a school that became a university, he was a musician, and he was a painter. He left behind him at his death a massive body of work, including 2,000 songs for which he wrote both the words and the music, two of which have become the national anthems of India and Bangladesh. His life's goals, as he gathered together this massive learning of his goal was to achieve a vision of international understanding and cultural synthesis. For example, the school that he founded taught both an Indian and a non-Indian curriculum in ways that tried to blend them, tried to see the common points where they could blend and be syncretistic with each other. He was one of the most prominent Indian figures to support Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian independence movement, but he always reminded Gandhi throughout the entire movement not to be too nationalistic, but to focus on international goals. He saw Gandhi himself, in fact, as a kind of beautiful blending of Eastern and Western ideas. He said that Gandhi had taken the idea of a Christian God, the Christian idea of a God who becomes man to save the world by taking sin and suffering on himself, and had turned it into the principle of nonviolent struggle. So he saw Gandhi himself as being a perfect blend of these two. In a kind of longish short story that Tagore wrote called Broken Ties, he sends his protagonist, an Indian protagonist, through a period of Western atheism and utilitarianism inspired by Thomas Malthus and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And then he sends him from there through a period of Indian mysticism under the influence of a very learned Swami, and finally to a kind of reconciliation of the two brought about by his relationship with a young widow who has also become a disciple of the Swami and who eventually teaches the protagonist how to honor both the spiritual and the physical sides of himself, both the Eastern and the Western sides simultaneously, and how to achieve a kind of harmonic balance between them. His religion was also syncretistic, blending elements of Hinduism and Buddhism and Western religions into a religion that he called the deity of life, in which, as he saw it, the divine keeps advancing and retreating out of ordinary life, out of nature. Sometimes, in occasional glimpses, in a flash of insight, we will see God in some other human being. We will see God in some piece of nature. We will see God. And so for him, the deity kept retreating and advancing in and out of ordinary life. And so that for him, the deity was always at once distinct from the world and a part of the world. In a poem, he explains how this works. And this is a poem that he wrote himself and then translated. The translation, as he translated himself, he translated into English prose. But here is what he says in that poem. At midnight, the would-be ascetic announced, "This is the time to give up my home and seek for God. Ah, who has held me so long in delusion here?" God whispered, "I," but the ears of the man were stopped. With a baby asleep at her breast lay his wife, peacefully sleeping on one side of the bed. The man said, "Who are ye that have fooled me so long?" The voice said again, "They are God," but he heard it not. The baby cried out in its dream, nestling close to its mother. God commanded, "Stop, fool, leave not thy home," but still he heard not. God sighed and complained, "Why does my servant wander to seek me, forsaking me?" And that's Rabindranath Tagore's idea of the deity of life. In another poem called Flute Music, there's a poor man who lives in a miserable, dirty street which is littered with dead cats and fish gills and fruit peelings. But one night he hears a neighbor playing on his cornet. He lives on a street called Milkman's Lane. And at some point in the poem, the music of the cornet becomes the music of the flute. And we suddenly realize that we have just been lifted into the world of Krishna, the incarnation of Vishnu, who called in the earlier stories milkmaids with his flute music. You remember we talked about this, we talked about the Bhagavad Gita back in Lecture 9. The speaker of the poem here has run away from an arranged marriage, but this music of the universe, which he suddenly hears in the cornet music coming from his neighbor's window, that music suddenly transforms the woman that he has run away from into a symbol of the divine, and the street, this nasty, dirty street that he lives on, into a street that points toward heaven. As Rabindranath Tagore thought, any single moment the divine can enter into our lives and touch us in this kind of way. Because he was such a syncretistic figure, many of his stories blend Eastern and Western forms and themes together. There's one really great story of his called The Hungry Stones, and this one is really, I think, as much an Eastern story as it is a Western story, and it makes several specific allusions to the 1001 Nights in order to structure its own story. The story is a nested one, as we have talked about many times in this course. The Indians were perhaps the people who taught other writers how to nest stories. The story is a nested one. Two young men meet a third man on a train. The third man starts telling these two young men a story, and the story, then they arrive at a train station, and they all have to get off. They get off at the train station, and then this third man, continues telling his story in the train station to the two young men. The story he tells is about one time when he was sent into the country as a collector of cotton duties for the British colonial government. He winds up staying in a deserted palace that's centuries old, and each night he's tantalized by half-seen visions of Persian maidens who tempt him down corridors like labyrinths. Even when he can't quite see them, he can half scent their vanished perfume and half hear the ring of their laughter or the jingle of their bracelets. Every night he gets drawn deeper and deeper into this vision of the palace, and as he is drawn into this vision, he begins slowly, piece by piece, to abandon his British clothing, and he more and more loses himself in the dream of India's past. At one point, he decides, he tells an old man whom he meets about what's happening to him in the palace, and then the old man begins to tell him a story. This is a story within a story within a story. Doesn't it sound like Scheherazade? But before he can get that one finished, before the old man can finish his story within a story, the narrator gets separated from his listeners. He has to catch his next train. He gets on the train and goes off, and the two young men never hear the end of the story. On the one hand, of course, this is a very witty reminder of the Scheherazade technique. You always try to end the story just at some point of suspense, so the king will keep her alive for one more night to hear what happens next. In this case, we never do find out what the ending of that story would have been, but the story, insofar as it gets told, is a really brilliant and beautiful reminder about the divisions that have to live inside every modern Indian, who is half colonized, half British, half Indian, whose daytime empirical life may be in dramatic contrast to the nighttime emotional life. It's a really brilliant and beautiful story. But of course, in addition, Rabindranath Tagore also wrote Western-style realist stories, which contain social criticism, are told from an objective point of view, and are as much interested in psychology as they are in external plot events. One of the subjects that he deals with repeatedly in his stories is the suppression of women in Indian culture, especially in rural villages. Two of his novels, Speck in the Eye and The Broken Nest, deal with this issue, and he wrote a series of very famous short stories which deal with the same topic: The Living and the Dead, The Girl Between, Broken Ties, which we took a brief look at, and one we'll take a closer look at right now, called Punishment. Punishment takes place in a rural village among working-class Indians. Two brothers live in the same house with their wives. After one very hard and very humiliating day at work, they come home to find out that supper isn't ready. The older brother chides his wife. She snaps at him, and he is so much strung out, so much at the edge, that without even thinking, he draws his knife and kills her. The brothers are trying to decide what to do when their landlord shows up at the worst possible time. And in a fit of panic, when he wants to know what's going on, in a fit of panic, the younger brother, whose name is Cheatham, blurts out that his wife had been fighting with his older brother's wife, something that happened every day, and she's the one who had killed her sister-in-law. What we are told is that the reason he says this, the reason he blurts this out in a panic, is an old Indian adage that if one loses a wife, she can always be replaced. You cannot replace a brother. Cheatham instantly regrets this panicked response, but his wife, whose name is Chandra, is deeply hurt by a husband with whom she had always shared a very passionate relationship. She accepts the accusation, she admits it, and she sticks to it in court, even when the two brothers break down, change their story, and each one of them confesses that he's the one who did the murder. She forces the court to sentence her to death, and she refuses to see her husband before she's hanged. The story is mostly told from Chandra's point of view, so the story is, as Chekhov had taught us, is really more psychological and social in orientation. But its point really is, its social point really is an entire culture's attitudes toward women. When Cheatham instinctively responds as he does, he's reflexively saying something that he's been taught all his life, doing what we all do in moments of panic when we just blurt something out. What we blurt out is likely to be some of the oldest and deepest things that we know. What makes it worse for him is the fact that he doesn't feel this way about his wife. We're given some background to the marriage. Both of them are attractive and healthy young people whose passionate attachment to each other has been spiced in the past by some jealousy on both sides. She's also a woman of high spirit. We're told that one morning she had had an argument with her husband, and he locked her in her room when he went to work. When he came home that night, we're told she was 3 villages away living with an uncle, and Cheatham, with great difficulty, persuaded her to return. So there have been tensions in the marriage, but the pair truly love each other. He says what he says only because in a crisis, he says the first thing that comes to his mind, not what he really feels, but just as a kind of instinctive, reflexive action. There's an old Indian saying that says his lips spoke what his heart didn't feel, and that's exactly what he did here. But he does say it. And Chandra is so insulted and so outraged that she chooses death rather than go on living with him. It's her punishment of him, which makes the title of the story, Punishment, really highly ironic as well. In court, she's asked, "Does your husband love you?" And she says, "He loves me greatly." And then she's asked, "Do you love your husband?" And she says, "I love him greatly." But at the end, when she's asked if she wants to see anybody, Before she dies, she asks to see her mother, not her husband. When told that her husband wants to see her, she says, "To hell with him." The Indian, I guess, literally means death to him, but whatever she says what she means, death to him, to hell with him, and an entire culture which nurtures this kind of behavior. Her death sentence is not a sacrifice, but it's a revenge. We're also reminded, of course, that Cheatham's way of thinking is very traditional. In India particularly, in the Mahabharata, we remember at the very beginning of that epic, Draupadi is shamed before an enemy's family. 4 brothers want to protect her, but because it's their older brother who's gotten her into this situation in the first place, they accept what happens to her out of loyalty to a brother. So this is a very long-standing tradition in Indian life. What are Chandara's weapons against all of this tradition? She has only her life to offer against it. The case is made worse by the Indian practice of taking a young girl of 10 or 12 years old and then sending her to her husband's house to be blended into the wives of other men in the house. At the end, the narrator tells us that years ago, when a little girl had left her dolls in her father's house to live with her new in-laws, who could have imagined these events? He says that her father on his deathbed had been happy that at least he had accomplished and arranged a happy future for his little girl. Who would have thought? It's always, for these young girls, these 10 or 12-year-old girls getting transferred into a new family, it's always a horrible adjustment. And it's one reason why in Indian life, why having children is so important, since caring for a child takes a lot of time and energy and takes the pressure off a marriage relationship and the pressure off the relationship with the other women in the house. But Chandara is childless, so marriage is pretty much all she has, especially since she and her sister-in-law decidedly don't get along with each other. They fight all day long, every day. So the story is, like one of Ibsen's plays, is about social habits and customs and the oppression that they bring, even though these terms are delivered to us in psychological terms rather than specifically social ones. And it's probably an accurate story too, because since for all of us, societal norms get internalized until they seem to be part of us. So the story is also about the way we absorb values from culture and the way we live by them, even when they run counter to our own desires or needs. Kalpana Barden, in a collection of this kind of stories by Tagore and others, says this about the ending of this story. The oppressor is ultimately some aspect of the cultural ideology and the social situation in which both men and women find themselves trapped because of some socially bred dysfunction of the individual will and psyche. The tragedy lies in the distortions that their personalities and relationships suffer under the tyranny of social mores and beliefs, in the havoc that ingrained ideas can play on human mind and behavior. The climax comes with the realization that habitual notions have led one to blindness, to closed doors, to barriers for more humane choices, ultimately to becoming one's own jailer. It is then too late to change the rules, even though the nature of the problem has been perceived. All that remains is the shattering knowledge that the ideas one has always lived by are wrong, oppressive, and mindless. The loss, the unraveling of accustomed life is often terminal, beyond redemption. What I think is really interesting about that little paragraph is that could have been said of any single one of Ibsen's plays as well. The problem in Indian life is always exasperated at the fringes of society. Cheatham is a landless man. He's a day laborer without any social power at all. So society teaches him to exercise it where he can in his marriage. He doesn't feel this way about Chandara, but he behaves this way anyway. And he shows us how social poisons can permeate us, especially at times of crisis. This is also a story about an unconventional Indian woman. She's not a typical Indian woman in Indian fiction. She's a woman who fights back in the only way she can. And in this way, she reminds us of other women of the literature of the period who gave up their lives or their happiness to make a point. We remember Catherine Earnshaw in Wuthering Heights or Norma Helmer in A Doll's House. And we may even remember Hedda Gabler in Ibsen's play Hedda Gabler, who commits suicide at the end of her play as a kind of protest against all the cultural and historical pressures that imprison her, which is pretty much what Chandra does here. And we remember also that Tagore said that one of the big influences on him was that of Henrik Ibsen. This is what an Indian writer looks like at the beginning of the century, using Western forms for Eastern material. Next time, we'll take a look at the same phenomenon as it occurs in Japan, where the realist mode arrived at about the same time and helped to produce one very important early modern female writer in the realist tradition, Higuchi Ichio.